This is a calm bedtime reading based on the novel titled 1984 by George Orwell. The soothing narration begins now. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Imagine then the city itself, air and stone and metal touching the skin like a cold hand. Winston Smith, a thin, ordinary man whose life had long ago settled into small, exact patterns, moved quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions. The wind chased paper and dust along the pavements outside. It slid beneath the door and across the hall, where the smell of boiled cabbage and worn mats lay like a familiar, unwelcome blanket. A poster hung on the landing, a face made enormous by its own declaration. Broad mustache, dark watchful eyes. The letters beneath it read, in the blunt way slogans do, "Big Brother is watching you." There was a strange tranquility in the very certainty of that gaze. It watched, always. And because it watched, people learned to keep their faces smooth, their expressions steady, their ordinary motions measured. Winston climbed slowly up the stairs, pausing often. The flat was 7 flights up, and his right ankle burned with an ulcer that always itched at the worst times. Inside his flat, a cold oblong of a room, the thin, bright voice of production statistics issued from the telescreen. Winston fitted his hands around a cup of visionless Victory gin, the liquid burning like acid down his throat, but finally freeing his breathing in the small way that liquor sometimes will. He set the cup down, and something else came to hand. An old book, its paper creamy and a little foxed at the edges. It felt almost indecently beautiful in his fingers, a remnant of another time, whose taste he had not fully earned. It had been bought in a junk shop. For $2.50, he had brought it home, furtive and guilty. It was the sort of thing you were not supposed to possess. Yet he kept it. That night, cupping the small lamp's pool of light, he opened the book, and to the quiet of the room and the drone of the telescreen, he began to write. The act of making a line of ink on a page was small and dangerous, and simple all at once. He wrote just a date, and then let his pen hurry. The sentences that came were not polished. They were the sudden weather of memory and small feeling. A film from the night before, the sight of a war scene in the pictures, people's laughter at a suffering images that stayed with him like thorns. Winston's life, as the book would show him in the days that followed, was made of such small acts. He worked dutifully in the records department at the Ministry of Truth. His job was to make the past match the present, to edit the newspapers, change statistics, and write histories that told the story the party needed to be true. He knew, with the private ache of it, that he was altering things that had once been facts. He watched the machines. He rewrote speeches. He clipped corrections that would be fed into pneumatic tubes and sent to the great unseen furnaces where the old words were consumed. The past, as he wrote in the diary that night with hands that still shook a little, was a palimpsest, scraped and rewritten again and again. And yet Winston was not merely a small cleric of forgery. Inside him, there was a quiet, private life of thought. Some mornings, a dream would come at him like a tide, taking him to a place he called the Golden Country, a green meadow, a stream under willows, a girl of dark hair who walked through the grass and threw off her clothes with a single perfect gesture, as if shedding the whole burden of the world. The dream stayed with him. It was a counterweight to the gray monotony of Airstrip 1. At work, things happened that seemed commonplace until you paused and tasted them. The 2 minutes hate was one of these rituals. The entire office would gather and watch the flickering face of Emmanuel Goldstein, a body of images and accusation set against the backdrop of an enemy army. The room filled with noise, hisses, curses, a rising, animal-like ferocity that erased the more complicated feelings a man might have. For a moment, the crowd's rage released anyone from private thought. The faces of men and women around Winston would morph. Fear, rage, adoration of the image of Big Brother that followed Goldstein's face, and the slow, muttered chant of BB, which rose like some primitive drum. It was in these public noises that Winston sometimes felt, briefly, less alone. There was once a look from O'Brien, a man of inner party rank, that sparked the strangest hope in him. For a heartbeat, it seemed that another mind, large, grave, and watchful like the portrait of Big Brother, had made contact with his own. He understood something that the surrounding crowd did not. That to meet another thinking person was like discovering a hand in the dark. From the diary to the dream to the street, with its torn posters and the sullen drone of helicopters overhead, Winston's days stitched together a life that seemed to vibrate on the brink of two worlds. One world was the public grid of telescreens, slogans, and rhythmic hatred. The other, the secret inner world of memory, private longing, and the preserved old book. When he met the dark-haired girl from the fiction department, the thread that connected him to the possibility of change grew taut. She moved through those corridors like a quick wind, athletic, direct, not much interested in words. To Winston, she was at first only a figure of suspicion, an instrument of the party maybe, or worse, the living symbol of the Junior Anti-Sex League with its red sash, the sign of public chastity. But the world has a way of rearranging itself. On a raw morning, she fell on an icy patch, and in the quick exchange of hands, there was a scrap of paper. "I love you." It might have been a trick. It might have been the trap of the thought police. It might have been a miracle. What it was, to Winston, was an opening. The two of them met clandestinely. First in the noisy canteen with its greasy trays and tinny music, then in the park among leafless shrubs, until they learned to carve out small, careful times for one another. They learned to speak in the middle of crowds without being heard, to fold spoken sentences into silences. They developed the skill of secret gestures and a map of safe places. And the clearer that the girl's intentions were her scorn for the party's hypocrisies, her taste for small transgressions and pleasures, the deeper Winston's appetite for a life with her became. She taught him how to dodge attention, how to pretend, and in quieter hours, she gave him jam and coffee and stories of the fiction department, of cheap novels, of machine-made passions, of a people dulled but not entirely extinguished. All of this existed in parallel to the larger, colder processes moving in the city. News came and was changed, alliances shifted, and the Ministry of Truth constantly called upon him and his colleagues to rewrite the footprints of events. Winston performed his part. He altered speeches to match the course that events had in fact taken. He manufactured Comrade Ogilvy out of whole cloth for a speech about heroism. He watched the pneumatic tubes carry away clippings that would be rendered ash. He understood, slowly and stubbornly, that his work created historical riverbeds that future rains would have to follow. Perhaps a year, perhaps longer, time thinned into a series of hours and measures. There came a day when something larger arranged itself. O'Brien, the man whose eyes had once seemed to share a thought with Winston's in the crowded records department, made contact. A single scrap of paper, a private address, given in a way that could almost be mistaken for casualness, carried with it a promise and danger. An invitation to his flat to look at the 10th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary. To Winston, with his secret diary and his scraped memories, it felt like a door opening behind a wall. They had both been hanging on small hopes for so long that to accept the door swept them, instantly and overwhelmingly, into a new story. O'Brien was all manner of things, an inner party man, yes, and in his bearing a sort of savage civility, a man who moved as if the world did not annoy him, but was a place he could shape. In the privacy of his flat, a different air reigned. The telescreen could be temporarily silenced. The voice was turned off. There, O'Brien spoke with quiet certainty about a brotherhood, an underground movement, about Goldstein's myth, and a book that contained the truth of their times. He asked them whether they would be willing to do anything, betray, hurt, sacrifice, on behalf of a cause whose ultimate outcome might never be seen. When Winston and Julia said yes, the answer was not bravado, but the simple yielding of two people who wanted a path to somewhere different. Soon after, on the edge of the everyday world, where the proles moved and loved and gambled and sang, Winston found the book. The way it arrived was small and clever. A briefcase mislaid on the pavement at the exact right time, a tiny, private exchange. Inside was the manuscript that put the logic of Ingsoc into words, and in reading it, Winston felt an odd, unmixed relief. The book explained a terrible arithmetic of power. 3 superstates balanced in permanent war. The use of war to consume surplus goods. The deliberate falsifying of the past, so that the parties present could not be contradicted. It named the methods that made the party strong, and the human reasons why oligarchies preserved themselves. Yet the book did not light him into action. It set before him a rigorous, almost scholastic view of the world. That that civilization might be kept, as it was only by the party's control over memory, over language, over the very concepts people used to think. It described newspeak and how the vocabulary would shrink until the capacity to conceive rebellious ideas simply withered. There was a bleak comfort in it, like seeing a map of a disease and understanding how it moved through the body. Winston read and reread and found in it many confirmations of what he had always known as a sense, that the party's dominion was not merely brute force, but a system of ideas that made resistance almost unthinkable. Still, reading did not break the small private chain between him and Julia. If anything, the book and the meetings made their few stolen hours more sacred and more fragile. And then, as all fragile things do, it broke. There had been small signs, absurd and surprising, the sudden, brutal appearance of a patrol where there had been none, a face glimpsed through an alley that matched a wanted poster. Once, in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, as the music made people nod their heads in predictable time, a person in the corner with bright eyes and a quiet face was listening too closely. And then, inevitably, the long hand of the party tightened. Arrest came in the dead of night with a jerk that snapped every sleep from him. There was the clattering of boots, the blaze of lamps into the face, the feeling of being wrenched from bed. For a moment, Winston and Julia were both frozen in a kind of stunned disbelief. Then she was gone from his sight, like an ember blown by the wind. They took Winston to the Ministry of Love. It was a place that had no windows and no tenderness, a hollow of white tiled rooms and hidden cells, where the air seemed to hum with some low, fierce machinery. For a long time, the process had no name. There were bland official interrogations, the small questions, the twisting of his own words back at him. There were staff in white coats with clipped, polite phrases, and guards with fists and boots whose blows were at first simple, and then with the practiced rhythm of sport. The beatings and the electric touches were designed with a frightening care. Pain, Winston discovered, had the astonishing ability to simplify thought. When it visited him, it took his memories one by one and stripped them down. For a time, he discovered that all he cared for was to stop the pain. This had worked its way into the core of him. Most terrifying were the sessions when his mind lay naked before O'Brien. In those hours, he saw the face of the man who had once signaled to him in the 2 minutes hate stand above him, calm and almost clinical. This was the man who had told him that Big Brother was not merely a figurehead, but the posture of a whole society. It was the man who practiced the method by which they made people change, until the wrongness inside them did not merely cease to be acted upon, but ceased to be the subject of thought at all. O'Brien stepped a step further still. He showed Winston the mechanisms with a deliberate, humble pride. He spoke of power as an end in itself. Then, with the gracious cruelty of teachers, he made the experiment of applying the simplest reality tests and showing Winston, by pain and by exercise, that what one might call objective fact could be made into something else if the human mind that perceived it was made to perceive differently. O'Brien's experiments were not merely crude physical torments. He took Winston through a scavenger's curriculum of epistemology. He held up his hand and asked how many fingers he had. Winston answered truthfully, 4. O'Brien, by pain and by will, taught him to say 5 with a conviction that made the muscles of his face twist. Later, when he could be made to accept that 2 + 2 = 5 in an instant without contradiction, what he had accepted was no arithmetic, but the larger surrender of his trust in an external sense of reality. The goal was not simply confession, but the sterilizing of the inner life. The party wanted to move beyond obedience. It wanted an allegiance that made alternative facts and private memories vanish like traces in sand. Winston's long ordeal culminated in a room beyond the reach of light, room 101. For each prisoner, there waited a particular horror, tailored to the private fractures of fear and revulsion. For Winston, it was the rats. They were presented to him in a wire box, a mask built to thrust them against a face. The terror of the rats was not only the terror of being eaten, it was the terror of having the private place beneath the skin violated by an animal's instinct, a violation of the intimate self beyond any explanation or argument. In the final instant, when everything that had been thought and felt by Winston clattered into the emptiness of defeat, he did what he could not imagine he would ever do. He begged for the thing to be done not to him, but to Julia. O'Brien had wanted to create not merely obedience, but change. He had wanted Winston to learn a single, terrible lesson, that whatever the party decreed could be made to be the truth in any mind, and that there would be nothing left inside that mind to call the party's rule into question. The lesson had been learned when, crouching before a portrait of Big Brother, Winston found his last rebel thought undone. In the hours that followed his return to the world, which some people still called the world, Winston changed. His body grew plumper, his ulcer healed, his appetite came back. He found a small job again. He sat in the chestnut tree, and the portrait of Big Brother looked down at him. He could watch the news and feel that the victories of the party, even the twisting of alliances and errors and histories, were fixed. They were the only thing that mattered. In the end, the last private thing he preserved, a memory of love for Julia, was removed like a splinter under a nail. Time moves differently at the end. Weeks smoothed into months, months into a kind of uniform day. Winston's days were full of small gratifications now. The taste of tea sweetened properly for once, the warmth of the room, the chessboard waiting in the chestnut tree, news that lit the day like fireworks. He would sometimes remember a childhood moment and feel a softness, but soon the thought would be pressed down, like a page turned in a thick book. If you could be made convinced that black was white, then all the world's distinctions were the parties to rewrite. if you could come to love the haters who made you small, then everything else, companionship, rebellion, memory, was a vanishing point. The world beyond Winston's small life continued, as always in a great rhythm the party provided. The war moved, front lines slid, alliances shifted, and were claimed to have never been otherwise. The ministries stood like mountains in the pale sky. The ministry of truth shaping the past, the ministry of peace conducting the present wars, the ministry of plenty managing rations in a permanent shortage, and the ministry of love remaining the secret sanctum, where the last fractures of the human mind were hammered into the right shape. If you imagine yourself now, lying in the dark and listening, it is easy to let the longing for resistance live in a corner of your own chest. It is natural to keep a small light hidden in your sleep and to say quietly to yourself truths that cannot be advertised. Yet, it is also possible to imagine what it would be to place that light, willingly, under a glass and let it dim. Winston's story is the long story of how a life of resistance can be folded into the world's fabric and smoothed until the edges vanish. His last hours were not dramatic. They were quiet as a hand laid across a forehead. The great thing that had seemed impossible, the individual standing forever apart from the mass, had given way. He was no longer at war with the image and the machine. He could not hold to the old beliefs and the old formulas. He had been brought, as O'Brien promised, to the place where there was no darkness, a place without refuge, but with a kind of terrible order. Now, as you drift in a quieting darkness, you may find it a complex thing to hold the last light, to balance the knowledge of human frailty and the urge to keep your own private facts, the things you remember and love, intact. This evening's story, gentle and sorrowful, is not simply a tale of defeat. It is a reminder that inner life depends on memory, language, and small acts of courage. The little things you do, the things you keep inside you that no one can change, carry a dignity, even if they may never be triumphant in the world's loud terms. So breathe slowly and feel your body expand and fall with the soft movement of night. Remember Winston standing in the quiet table light, the smallness of his handwriting, the courage that led him to put ink on a page as an act against a machine. Remember the image of the golden country, with the stream and the willows, and the thrush pouring out its song into the empty air, because the bird itself had no need to be known. There is something quietly stubborn in that music. It has no audience and needs none. For now, let that small, bright sound be enough. The city outside is still. The posters flap someday, and the telescreens hum the same small half-truths. But inside, the human heart keeps its own private map. Rest with that map now. Let it hold the names and the little scenes that mean only to you, the sound of a laugh, a corner of a book, a hand in the dark. They cost nothing. They require only your careful keeping. Sleep arrives gently. You are safe here, with the light low and the book closed. let the breath in your chest fall and rise until it matches the slow cadence of the street outside and the invisible turning of the world. Sleep well.